Lucida, thank you.
Application CICS 1 2026. On the Commission's own motion, 2026 State Wage Order pursuant to Section 58 of the Act, Part 3.
Yes, now no appearances other than Mr Hanson. You're appearing for Unions WA this morning, we believe. Thank you very much. Well, we've relisted the matter, obviously, to hear from the parties in relation to the Fair Work Commission decision. Also, as our associate indicated, with the publication of the Australian National Accounts yesterday, we thought it might be a useful opportunity if any party wished to say something about those. We're not requiring it, but it might be a useful opportunity if any submissions wanted to be made about those accounts as well. So, should we turn to the Minister?
Yes, thank you, Chief Commissioner. On Tuesday, an expert panel of the Fair Work Commission delivered the Annual Wage Review 2026 decision. The expert panel decided to increase all modern award minimum rates of pay by 4.75% effective from 1 July 2026. In addition to this increase, the panel also determined to phase in a structural adjustment to the lowest paid classifications in modern awards, that is, those classifications with wage rates at the C13 and C14 level, so that the C12 level will become the lowest wage rate applicable to ongoing employment in the national system. As part of a staged implementation approach, all rates at the C13 level will be increased by a compounded 1.2%, in addition to the general 4.75% increase to modern award wages determined by the panel. Classifications at the C14 rate will also be increased by the same percentage amount as the C13 rate, so that the relativity between these two rates is maintained. I'll provide more detail about this structural adjustment in a moment. For now, the national minimum wage maintains its alignment with the C13 classification rate, which was established in the 2023 review. The national minimum wage will be increased to $1,004.90 per week, or $26.44 per hour, effective from 1 July 2026. This amounts to a 6% increase, which incorporates both the general review increase and additional increase for the structural adjustment. And then in accordance with usual practice, proportionate increases will flow to junior employees, apprentices and trainees, and employees with a disability. The Minister notes that in reaching its decision, the expert panel paid particular attention to the living standards and the needs of the low paid, the majority of whom are modern award reliant. So as I mentioned, in addition to a general increase in modern award wages, the panel also determined to phase in a structural adjustment to wage rates at the C13 and C14 level. The Minister notes that the possibility of such a structural adjustment was foreshadowed by the expert panel in the Annual Wage Review 2025 decision, and most parties in this year's review provided submissions on the issue. Currently, the national C13 rate is the lowest rate applicable to ongoing employment. However, rates of pay below C13 still exist in some modern awards as introductory rates for employees who are new to an industry. The C14 rate is an entry-level wage rate that's applicable only for a maximum period of 6 months of employment. The classifications and rates of pay in most modern awards are based on an application of the C10 Metals Framework Alignment Approach. It's intended that over a period of time, the lowest wage rate for ongoing employment will be moved up to the C12 level, and the panel intends that this move occur in 3 stages, with each stage increasing the C13 rate by an additional amount, representing 1/3 of the difference between the C13 and C12 rate. The pay difference between C13 and C12 is currently $34.40 per week, approximately 3.6%, so 1/3 of this difference is 1.2%. The first stage is being implemented as part of this year's decision, such that all rates at the C13 level will be increased by a compounded 1.2%, in addition to the general 4.75% increase to modern award wage rates determined by the panel. And this will establish a new interim minimum wage rate for ongoing employment across all modern awards. And as I mentioned earlier, classifications at the C14 rate will also be increased by the same percentage amount as the C13 rate, so that the relativity between these two rates is maintained. The panel noted it would be desirable for the second and third stages to be implemented in the next 2 annual wage reviews, but acknowledged that this is ultimately a matter for the expert panels conducting those reviews to determine. The primary objective of this adjustment is set out at paragraph 110 of the panel's decision, which is that it's a measure to assist the lowest paid non-award reliant employees to meet their needs and improve their relative living standards in circumstances where wages growth for modern award reliant employees has not kept pace with inflation over the last 5 years. The adjustment has the secondary objective of simplifying classification structures in modern awards by reducing the number of classifications and rates of pay with which employers need to comply. Many classifications below the C10 rate involve only marginal differences in skill levels and rates of pay, and the panel found their continued existence is difficult to justify. In addition, because employees earning below the C12 rate are over 57% female, this structural reform will disproportionately benefit low-paid female workers and aid achievement of the gender equality objectives set out in the Fair Work Act 2009. As part of implementing this phasing out of classifications below the C12 rate applicable to ongoing employment, the panel confirmed in its decision that the Fair Work Commission will initiate proceedings later this year to undertake a review of affected modern awards, and this is similar to the process that was undertaken by the Fair Work Commission following the realignment of the national minimum wage from the C14 rate to the C13 rate. And the Fair Work Commission estimates that this structural adjustment will affect around 100,000 of the lowest paid employees in the national system. A fundamental consideration for this year's review was that most modern award reliant employees remain in a position where the real value of their wage rates is lower than it was in July 2021, prior to the inflation spike after the COVID-19 pandemic. This real wage gap that's opened between the CPI and modern award rates of pay has particularly affected the living standards of the low paid and their capacity to meet their needs. The panel acknowledged that the rate of inflation for non-discretionary essential goods and services is significantly higher than the headline CPI rate of inflation. The loss in the real value of the national minimum wage has been less than for national modern award wages as a result of the high increase awarded to the national minimum wage in the 2023 review when it was realigned from the C14 rate to the C13 rate. And I note that a similar realignment to the state minimum wage took place in the 2024 state wage case. There is a noticeable proportion of employees who are paid at modern award rates on a medium to long-term basis, and the panel recognised that the living standards of these employees are much more dependent on the extent to which modern award wage rates maintain or lose their real value. The panel balanced consideration of the real wage gap against other matters which required some restraint in the quantum of the increase. It acknowledged that there's a large degree of uncertainty about the economy, at least in the near future. And it noted that while Australia's economic and business performance in 2025 was solid across a range of factors, including economic growth, productivity and business investment, and the labour market remained relatively strong, capacity constraints in the latter half of 2025 led to inflation increasing above the Reserve Bank's target band. The panel further noted that the disruption to global oil supplies resulting from the conflict in the Middle East accelerated inflation in Australia, both through direct effects on fuel prices and second-round impacts on the price of a range of goods and services. It was also cognisant of any signalling effect the decision in the annual wage review may have on inflationary expectations. So the panel took into account these moderating factors in determining the quantum of the increase. Given the present economic uncertainty, the panel concluded that while it cannot fully restore the real value of wages as they were in 2021 as a part of this year's review, it was minded to ensure that modern award reliant employees generally are not worse off in real terms than they were in July 2025. The expert panel also noted the relatively small contribution to the national wage bill made by the wages of modern award reliant employees, meaning the impact of annual wage review decisions is modest. As of 2025, this contribution sits at 11.2% of the total national wage bill. The panel noted that this is because modern award reliant employees tend to work less hours and are lower paid than the workforce average. It estimated that the 3.5% increase awarded in last year's review directly contributed no more than 0.36 of a percentage point to Australia's total wage price index for the year to March 2026, meaning that the national wage decision has only a very limited impact on aggregate wages growth. At paragraph 32 of the decision, the panel noted the data suggests that each percentage point increase to modern award wage rates as a result of the review moves the wage price index directly by roughly 0.1 of a percentage point annually. As in previous years, the panel highlighted that award coverage is concentrated in 4 industry sectors: accommodation and food services, administrative and support services, healthcare and social assistance, and retail trade, and these sectors account for over 2/3 of all modern award-reliant employees. The Minister notes that these industries are similarly highly award-reliant in Western Australia and make up a notable proportion of the state's workforce. The expert panel also acknowledged that modern award-reliant workers have different characteristics from the workforce as a whole. They are disproportionately female, working part-time hours, employed casually and low paid. And they also noted that this has changed significantly over the last decade as the modern award-reliant workforce has become more female, more likely to work part-time hours and more casualised. At paragraph 134 of its decision, the panel further identified that vulnerable groups in society, such as Indigenous Australians and immigrants not from the main English-speaking countries, are also disproportionately represented in the modern award-reliant cohort of employees. The Minister notes that award-reliant employees in the state system display similar characteristics to those working under national modern awards. The panel assessed that business, including businesses in the most modern award-reliant sectors and small businesses, was in a generally sound position prior to the conflict in the Middle East. It noted this conflict is the primary risk to business, but its full potential effect remains to be seen. The panel did not consider that its decision will have detrimental effects on productivity or the regulatory burden on business. At paragraph 49 of the decision, the panel noted that the industry sectors in which modern award-reliant employees are concentrated are not for the most part trade exposed, so it's unlikely that any reasonable outcome from the review will affect the international competitiveness of the national economy or of business generally. It also noted that reasonably modest review outcomes do not have adverse effects on hours worked or job loss, and that the experience of reviews since 2022, where the wage increases awarded have been relatively higher because of inflation, appears to confirm that there's no discernible adverse consequence for employment growth or the rate of unemployment. The Minister also notes that the panel acknowledged the decision to phase out junior rates of pay for employees aged 18 years and over in 3 national modern awards, the Retail Award, the Fast Food Award and the Pharmacy Award, as an important development since the Annual Wage Review 2025 decision. While the junior rates decision affected these 3 awards, the panel considered the findings have implications for junior rates across all modern awards, and that comprehensive reconsideration of junior rates in other awards will be necessary to ensure fairness. It indicated that the Fair Work Commission may initiate proceedings in this regard at a future point. Gender equality considerations also continue to be central to the review process. The panel noted that there's been progress in reducing the gender pay gap, and faster growth of modern award minimum wages compared with the wage price index has likely contributed to this. It considered that this year's decision will address the gender pay gap in a limited way. The gender-based undervaluation priority awards review, which commenced in the 2023 review decision and is now largely completed, will also contribute to a further narrowing of this gap in coming years. The Fair Work Commission is continuing to separately progress a number of gender pay equity matters. Following this year's annual wage review decision, the Minister reiterates support for an increase of state minimum wage and award rates of pay in this year's state wage case that takes into account cost of living pressures for award-reliant and minimum wage workers, is sustainable for employers and meets the needs of the low paid, and takes account of this year's annual wage review decision to ensure that state system employees are afforded fair minimum pay rates. As I've previously outlined, the expert panel awarded a general 4.75% increase to modern award wage rates in this year's annual wage review, and also made a structural adjustment to lowest paid classifications in modern awards, and those are the pay rates at the C13 and C14 levels, which is equivalent to an additional compounded 1.2% increase. The national minimum wage, which is aligned to the C13 rate, will increase to $1,004.90 per week, or $26.44 per hour. The Minister notes that in the National Industrial Relations System, the national minimum wage applies to only employees who are not covered by a modern award or an enterprise agreement, and it's estimated that only a very small number of employees throughout Australia are directly affected by the national minimum wage. The Minister also notes that the expert panel determined its decision using aggregate figures at the national level. For the state wage case, WA's economic context is somewhat different. While the per CPI forecast for the financial year 2025-26 is higher than nationally, that is, annual growth in the per CPI excluding electricity is currently sitting at 3.9% and is projected to be 5.5% for the 25-26 financial year. The WA economy is stronger overall, and recent ABS data indicates that Western Australia's labour market remains the strongest in the nation. As noted in the Minister's submission, the Minister submits that the decision of the expert panel in the Annual Wage Review 2026 is a relevant consideration for this year's state wage case and recommends the Commission take it into account in determining an appropriate and fair increase to wages for state system employees. Now as to the matter about the Australian national accounts that were released by the ABS yesterday, the Minister does want to make a comment about that. So the Minister notes that Western Australia's domestic economy grew by 3.2% over the year to the March quarter 2026, and it outpaced national growth of 2.9%. Private demand expanded by 4%, which was the fastest growth of all states, and it accounted for more than 90% of total domestic growth. Household consumption also grew at the fastest pace in the nation. It's also noted that business investment continues to grow strongly and accounts for almost a fifth of business investment nationally. Dwelling investment also increased 9.2%, the highest levels in 9 years. And finally, WA's economy recorded the fastest growth in the nation over the past 5 years. If it pleases the Commission in court session, that concludes the Minister's remarks, unless there are any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Laxton, for those submissions. Thank you. Mr Harding, for the CCI, please.
May it please the Commission in court. In Tuesday's decision, the Fair Work Commission handed down a 4.75% increase to a modern award rates of pay. The Fair Work Commission also reshaped the structure of the national minimum wage by aligning the to the C12 rate in a few stages. The Fair Work Commission, in their decision, acknowledges that the business climate continues to be uncertain, particularly for accommodation and hospitality businesses. In addition, the full bench noted the need for caution as the future outlook for inflation was uncertain. Their decision, in our view, rightfully begins to outline concerns with the economy going forward. CCRWA remains of the view that the rise of 3.25% provides an appropriate balance in meeting the needs of the low paid and managing the headwinds in the economy. I'll just make some remarks now about those headwinds. On inflation, the Fair Work Commission at paragraphs 38 and 39 stated that inflation has continued to grow beyond the target band of the RBA. It is important to note that this inflation increase was occurring prior to the conflict in the Middle East. With respect to this, we would point the Commission in court session to what the RBA outlined in their May statement of monetary policy and was referred to in our initial oral submissions, particularly to the comment around the upside risk of inflation in their statement of monetary policy. CCRWA also contends that while the inflationary impact of the Middle East conflict is important and must be considered, we continue to suggest that looking through this crisis, where sustained pressures are present in the economy prior to this conflict, we would consider consideration of the producer price index data that outlined in the CCRWA's initial submission, showing the increased pressures that producers in Australia are facing. There is, in our view, a continued risk to inflation once again becoming embedded in the WA economy and economy at large. This means if inflation comes up again and remains sustained, it will make any hard work that's been done over the past few years all in vain. We also submit that the wage arbiters must consider to a significant extent how permanent wage increases can drive inflationary pressures. This is through the signalling effect, which the full bench itself has acknowledged does occur. For this reason, we continue to caution any large, economically irresponsible wage increase and emphasise the importance of a responsible and balanced increase. In terms of the economic outlook, the Fair Work Commission made note of the uncertain and weakened economic outlook that is currently present to the Australian economy. In paragraphs 59 and 60, they did note that retail and accommodation food sectors at a national level, which are ones that predominantly fall in the WA state system, experienced a positive increase in conditions on the national level in 2025. However, as noted in the Minister's initial submission, the gross operating surplus and gross mixed income for these industries in WA went backwards.
Yes, interestingly, that's right. Yeah. But there's also somewhat anomalous result for retail that employment growth significantly picked up.
Yes.
So there's a bit of a contradiction. What we make of that, I don't know, but those are the figures.
Yes, it's I don't have any response,
And it was
unfortunately.
full-time
Yeah.
employment as well, not
Correct.
part-time.
Yes, which would indicate far more stronger conditions than otherwise, but obviously data is
It is what
suggesting
it
something
is.
else. Yeah.
Yes,
Sometimes they like to go in a counter-cyclical matter, don't they?
exactly.
On the national accounts, it does show that WA's economy is still mixed, and the initial rate rises are slowing the economy more broadly, both in Australia and Western Australia. Our state final demand is in the middle of the pact for this quarter at 0.5%. And going forward, the state and federal government budgets also expect a further slowing of the economy. As raised in our initial submissions, we hold significant concerns about the viability of WA businesses, particularly small and family businesses that would likely be captured in the state sector. The ASIC data in our initial submission paints a concerning picture with a significant rise in initial administrations of those businesses in those sectors. We hold the position, once again, that small businesses are disproportionately going to be impacted by any cost increases, as they generally have smaller profit margins and less capacity to influence the price, including supply pricing, compared to larger competitors. In the case of small businesses, increased wage costs are most likely going to be absorbed by reduced working hours or passed on cost increases to consumers, which will further add to cost of living pressures. This does not benefit anyone, not the employer, not the employee, the customers, or the economy at large. Just on wages growth briefly, unlike the national award system, the state award wages using C10 have had a cumulative growth of 0.4% in real terms from 2021 to the end of this year on the estimated amount. This is alongside the 3.78% cumulative rise for those reliant on the state minimum wage, as shown in our initial submissions. The argument that minimum wages have fallen in real terms of WA does not apply as it did in the Fair Work Commission's annual review. Importantly as well, CCIWA does note the commentary made in previous state wage cases that the Commission is to be cognisant of the impacts these wages have, setting a benchmark for wage negotiations across the economy. This position is also considered in the full bench at paragraph 132, where they state, "We are cognisant of any signalling effect our decision, and we are cognisant of any signalling effect the decision we make may have on inflationary expectations. We encourage the Commission in court to consider this when making their decision." Just in terms of productivity as well, the Commission continues to note that while productivity growth had occurred over the last year, at paragraph 135, it has stated that there has been no overall growth in productivity over the past 5 years. Productivity continues to remain a factor that the Commission considers on any real wage increases at the national level. While we respect the Commission and Court's position last year around the impact the state minimum wage increase may have on productivity, we contend, similar to the full bench of the Commission, the signalling impact of the decision can have an impact on broader wages growth itself. Just briefly on the C13 to C12 linking, while obviously wasn't mentioned by the Minister at this time, we would just contend that it's more appropriate to be done outside of the state wage case, and any additional increase in minimum wage should not be done to directly reflect this change at this time. And purely time is needed to fully understand the issues, and a separate general order which the Commissioner can bring on their own motion is probably more appropriate in dealing with this matter.
The Fair Work Commission's had the matter under consideration for many months.
Correct.
Undertook some fairly detailed research, and of course we've not had the ability in terms of time to deal with that. So trying to address that in these proceedings would be extraordinarily difficult.
Yes, yeah.
And I think probably not prudent nor responsible.
Correct.
To be frank.
No, I absolutely agree, and it was more just to be quite clear on that. This concludes my remarks today, Chief Commissioner and Commissioners. As noted in our oral submissions, we make the case again that the economic environment for a large increase in the state minimum wage is not there. The fundamentals of the WA economy are being challenged by a myriad of local, national and international factors. In light of this year's annual wage review decision, CCIW believes that it's important to consider a 3.25% increase to the state minimum wage and award rates of pay. This, in our view, will allow the Commission to satisfy all considerations required under the state wage case. If there's any questions as well.
No, thank you. Did you wish to say anything about the national accounts, Mr.
Beyond just the very brief point that I made in my remarks around that we are now at the middle of the pack on that, and I also note that while obviously productivity does change quarter to quarter, there was a large drop on the national level of 0.6%.
The December figures were given up, seemingly.
Pretty much. So it would be obviously the data prior to December also is quite positive, as it would be expected, but we can now see that slowing of the economy as expected from the increased interest rates, more broadly the inflationary pressures that are kind of coming through as well, which is
And I
now
suppose
starting to show.
the March quarter GDP figure, of course, only captured the first month of the conflict in the Middle East. So I suppose that the Q2 figure would be more revealing, I suspect.
The June figure is going to be the most appropriate. The economists who are far smarter than I am on this stuff has kind of said that June quarter will be the one that will show most of the impact.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Hannah. Mr. Henson, can you give us WA, please?
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. Unions WA continues to rely upon our previous written and oral submissions. We continue to contend that a real wage increase for award and minimum waged workers is needed to prevent real income losses becoming entrenched and low waged workers being further disadvantaged. Unions WA considers that a 6.5% increase across award wages would achieve this outcome. In light of the expert panel of the Fair Work Commission's decision in relation to the national minimum wage and our previous submissions regarding the potential for a realignment from the C13 to the C12 rate, we do submit that there should be an additional compounded 1% increase to the state minimum wage. The expert panel, as other parties have noted, has determined to proceed with the phasing out of the C13 level, with the objective, as noted at paragraph 110, that the C12 level becomes the lowest rate applicable to ongoing employment. This will, the expert panel states, have the primary objective of being a measure to assist the lowest paid modern award-reliant employees, meet their needs and improve their relative living standards in circumstances where wages growth for modern award-reliant employees has not kept pace with inflation over the last 5 years. Nationally, the pay difference between the C13 and C12 level is approximately 3.6%. To begin closing this gap as part of ultimately phasing out the C13 level, the expert panel has increased the C13 rate by a compounded 1.2% in addition to the general increase that was awarded, resulting in a 6% increase to the national minimum wage. The panel notes that closing this difference further may be achieved by making additional 1.2% increases to the C13 at a second, third and third stage. Unions WA submitted earlier in these proceedings that we considered, if the expert panel did decide to phase out the C13 rate, that we thought it would be necessary for such an approach to be adopted for the state minimum and award rates. Unions WA notes that our claim for a 6.5% increase would avoid the issue that occurred in 2023 when the national C13 and C14 realignment was made that pushed the national minimum wage above the state minimum wage at that time, as the new national minimum wage will be 5.45% higher than the current state minimum wage. Our submission, however, is that commencing that realignment path now would provide a smoother approach than what otherwise may need to be a larger jump later, depending on what increases are awarded as a part of the annual wage review and state wage cases in future years. As we noted in our initial submission, the gap between the WA C13 and C12 rates is slightly narrower than that nationally, sitting at approximately 3%. As such, following the expert panel's approach would necessitate a compounded 1% increase in addition to the general increase to award wages over 3 decisions in order to close that gap. At the same time, as the state C12 rate is slightly lower than the national rate, it would be necessary for the general award wage increases to be such that the state C12 rate grew to be and remained larger than that nationally, so as to avoid the state minimum wage being lower than the national minimum wage. As Unions WA has articulated in past proceedings, we consider that having a state minimum wage that is lower than that nationally would not provide for fair wage standards in the context of living conditions generally prevailing in the community, and would place the lowest paid Western Australian workers in the state industrial relations system at a unique financial disadvantage. In the first instance, a 6.5% increase to state award rates would place the state C12 rate higher than the national rate. Unions WA has 4 other observations that we wish to highlight in the expert panel's decision that we believe are both salient and relevant to these proceedings before touching on yesterday's national accounts release. The first observation relates to the issues of the real wage gap and the ongoing efforts by the expert panel to close it. At paragraph 7, the expert panel notes that despite the particular challenges that they must consider as part of this year's decision, a fundamental consideration which must be balanced against these matters is that modern award-reliant employees are still in the position where their wage rates, in real terms, remain lower than they were in July 2021, prior to the post-pandemic spike in inflation. The real wage gap, which has opened between the rate of the CPI and modern award wage rates, has particularly affected living standards of the low paid, the majority of whom are modern award reliant, and their capacity to meet their needs. This is particularly the case when the rate of inflation for non-discretionary essential goods and services is running significantly higher than the headline CPI rate of inflation. We note too the words of the expert panel at paragraph 93, where they state, as the ACTU submissions point out, looking at the reduction in real wages by reference to the CPI may understate the real effect of inflation upon low-paid workers who must devote a higher proportion of their income to non-discretionary expenditure items. Unions WA notes that the April 2026 CPI figures show that non-discretionary inflation for Perth increased from the same month of the previous year by 4.8%, far exceeding the headline's Perth CPI rate. Addressing the matter of April's Perth CPI figures more generally, Unions WA notes that the softening of the rate that inflation grew in the April CPI figures was shaped in part by the temporary easing of the contribution of automotive fuel, due to the temporary reduction of the fuel excise from 1 April. When that temporary reduction expires at the end of June, unless it is extended in some manner, it will contribute to a lift in headline inflation from that time. Perth's headline CPI increase was slightly softer than the national average, driven in part by a slightly lower growth in the housing category, recreation and culture, and comparatively little increase in the insurance and financial services category. In terms of the housing category, we note that this may be a matter of timing as to why it was lower than the national average, as the rents and new dwellings sub-indexes grew by more than that nationally, but the electricity sub-index of the housing component increased by more than 20% nationally, while only by 2% in Perth. So we think this may be the result of the timing of when different electricity rebates were applied to bills around the country. The April figures showed only modest signs of pass-through of higher fuel prices at this time, with the ABS commenting that the impacts of higher oil prices were mainly seen in products and services, with high freight and logistics costs, such as parcel delivery and building materials. While uncertainty remains around the extent of that pass-through, given tighter monetary policy, the April inflation outcomes do show that price growth is still elevated and weighing on the real incomes of award and minimum wage workers, with the rise in non-discretionary inflation having a particular impact on this cohort. The expert panel states at paragraph 41 that because of the one-off factors involved in this April CPI result, there is no present reason to think that the RBA's forecast of 4.8% for the year to June 2026 will be undershot. Unions WA notes too the expert panel's observations at paragraph 134, where they identify that vulnerable groups in society, such as Indigenous Australians and immigrants, not from the main English-speaking countries, are also disproportionately represented in the modern award-reliant cohort of employees. These characteristics operate to magnify the disadvantage of a reduction in real wages. Further, there is a proportion of employees who appear to be entrenched in modern award-reliant employment on a medium to long-term basis, and their living standards are therefore much more dependent upon the extent to which modern award wage rates maintain or lose their real value. We consider this statement by the expert panel relating to the particular vulnerability of award-reliant workers to be pertinent, especially in the light of case studies included in both the Unions WA and WACOS submissions that provided real-life examples of the experience of living on low pay. Secondly, we note the statements by the expert panel in terms of the potential impact of the decision on the national economy. The panel identifies that as external factors are currently the prime determinant of the headline CPI, the direct effect on WPI by increases to award wages arising from the review are, as stated by the expert panel at paragraph 48, unlikely to be sufficient to affect the rate of inflation in an appreciable way. In addition, the panel notes in paragraph 49 that the experience of reviews since 2022, in which relatively higher nominal wage increases have been awarded because of the rate of inflation, does not indicate any discernible adverse consequences for employment growth or the rate of employment. Further, in paragraph 50, they note there is no evidence of a causal relationship between review outcomes and the productivity performance of the Australian economy. Thirdly, we note too the remarks by the expert panel at paragraph 71 regarding the impact that increases to award rates can have on the gender pay gap. In addition to specific reviews of awards to eliminate gender under-evaluation, they note that increases to modern award minimum wage rates, which are above the rate of wage growth in the labour market generally, will, because of the higher proportion of women who are modern award reliant, operate to narrow the aggregate gender pay gap to some degree. This statement, we would suggest, is complementary with the findings of the research of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency that we cited in our earlier submissions. While it is certainly the case, as the expert panel notes, that the gender pay gap for the workforce as a whole cannot be eliminated by adjustments to modern award wage rates alone, we submit that the contribution to award wage increases can make is still absolutely vital. And finally, though it was the expert panel's position that they considered they could not close the real wage gap that has opened up since 2021 as part of this review, they determined that they should, as stated at paragraph 138, award a general increase that is sufficient to protect modern award-reliant employees against any further erosion in the real value of their wages, and to return such employees to the position relative to inflation achieved in the 2025 review. In determining what such an increase would be, the expert panel utilised the RBA's forecast of a CPI rate of 4.8% for the year to June 2026. Unions WA notes that on a state level, the most robust forecast that is available to us is that put forward in the WA budget of a 5.5% increase for the year to June 2026. And so in examining the projected trajectory for Perth CPI, we consider that this remains the relevant figure. We submit too that the stronger position of the Western Australian economy than that nationally, as outlined in the state budget, means that greater strides can be made as part of this decision in closing the real wage gap. Touching briefly on the national accounts data, we note that these figures largely predate the energy supply shock arising from the conflict in the Middle East that commenced in late February 2026. Unions WA submits that the growth outcomes suggest that the WA and the Australian economies confront the challenges ahead from a position of relative strength with solid private sector outcomes. WA's state final demand grew by 0.5% from the previous quarter, which was the same percentage change in December last year. Private gross fixed capital formation grew by 1.1%. General government final consumption expenditure fell by 1%. We note that the ABS identifies that the fall in state and territory spending across the board is linked to the ending of electricity rebate payments. Nevertheless, we suggest that the data suggests that there are vulnerabilities for workers. On the national level, the statistics show that the household savings ratio declined to 6.2% in March 2026, down from 7% in December 2025. The growth in gross disposable income at 0.4% was outpaced by the rise in nominal household consumption at 1.1%. It shows too that household spending rose 0.5% in the March quarter, including elevated spending on electricity, gas and other fuels, also linked to the cessation of the electricity rebates, raising out-of-pocket expenditure for households. Household spending on essential goods and services increased by 0.8%, while discretionary spending rose by 0.1%. The ABS suggests that discretionary spending was subdued due to higher interest rates and increased fuel costs likely influencing cautious consumer behaviour. In conclusion, Unions WA continues to advocate that the state's lowest paid workers should be given a real wage increase. This is critical in a particularly testing time for these workers. We contend that the risk to the state economy is negligible, but the impact on the lives of workers and their families is quite significant. If it pleases the Commission in court session, that concludes my submissions.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Hanson, for those submissions. Now for Welga, Mr Smith, please.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. We thank the Commission in court session for the opportunity to provide further oral submissions today on behalf of the West Australian local government sector in light of the Fair Work Commission's expert panel's decision to increase modern award rates by 4.75%. WALGA submits that while the Commission in court session is not bound by the Fair Work Commission's determination, the moderating factors identified in the annual wage review's decision should be given appropriate weight, having regard to their relevance to the state jurisdiction and the local government sector. In particular, WALGA notes the Fair Work Commission identified the accelerating rate of inflation, the significant decline in business confidence, and the ongoing input cost pressures arising from the conflict in the Middle East as moderating factors to be taken into account in setting the increase to modern award rates. In light of these moderating factors and the cautious approach adopted by the Fair Work Commission, WALGA submits that the Commission should exercise similar caution in determining the increase to the minimum state wage and the state award rates, having regard to the cost impact on local government and its limited capacity to raise revenue to absorb those costs. If it pleases the Commission in court session, that would conclude WALGA's verbal submissions.
Thank you very much indeed for
Thank
that,
you, Chair.
Mr. Smith. We thank you very much for your submissions in relation to the Fair Work Commission decision and also the national accounts. We'll now reserve our decision and our associate will be in contact with you when that is to be delivered, and we'll stand adjourned until then. Thank you very much.